Diversity, equity, and inclusion for real. We're going to reassure, educate, activate, and lead. And I am Chris. Oh, let's go to the next slide. I'm Chris Jones, and I should explain my t-shirt. I'm very casual today because I'm a Minnesota Vikings fan. And I went to my first game in 1961 as a youngster. And I've been a fan ever since, and I'm thinking this is the year. Vikings are playing Monday Night Football, and they're playing Chicago, another one of my favorite cities. And I hope ICE does not show up. Spectra Diversity is my company. We measure diversity, equity, inclusion for organizations and individuals in the same survey. And my partner is Nancy.
Hi, I'm Nancy Schick of Third Ear Conflict Resolution. I'm a New York employment attorney and global workplace mediator. And I've been doing these webinars with Chris this year as we navigate some of the frequent changes to diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, laws, both laws and executive orders and other types of policy changes that are trickling down in so many different ways. And so this is a topic near and dear to my heart. I've been doing this work since before we called it DEI, and it is my passion. So I'm out there trying to create more opportunities for people. And thank you all for coming.
And we want this to be interactive. So put something in the chat if you have a question, because we're a small group. So go ahead and do that. Okay, so first part, reassure. And it's work from home. So I'd like to know where you work. So on this, you can use your phone, click on the little thingy there, the icon, what's that
QR
called?
code.
Thank you.
Code.
Thank you. Thank you. Click on
It's
that.
Monday. Forgive us.
I know. It is Monday, and it's been a long weekend.
And it has been a year.
Yeah, oh boy, it has. Home office full time, that's me. And I have not worked in an office since 1985. I have been worked from home, either independent or as a contractor, 100% home office, and I really enjoy it. So far, I'm mostly home office full time. And that might be for our particular group, that might be how it lands, is that most people are both. So I'm going to move right along. So data, as I said, we want to have this be as interactive as it can be. So if you've got questions, please note them. And let's go through some data. Remote workers in the US save an average of 55 minutes a day by not commuting. The worldwide average is 72 minutes a day in commute time saved every day. 40% of remote workers were found to use that time that they saved working their primary or even secondary jobs. And better for the environment. Remote workers cut greenhouse gases by 54% by not commuting to the office compared to workers who do commute. They're cutting emissions even if they only work from home 1 day per week. So 1 day of remote work cuts 2%, while 2 to 4 days of remote cuts emissions by 29%. Remote workers, the top benefits that they say, the top 3 are saving money, flexibility, and the time, not having to commute. So in their free time, they use it to, they have freedom. Oh, no commute, save money, and flexibility. There, freedom. Remote workers use that freedom to nap, exercise, watch TV during the workday while working from home. I imagine they're doing that during their lunch break, not during their working time. Of the remote employees surveyed, 72% want to be able to take a nap or exercise during their workday. 73% watch TV, and employees who work from home enjoy the freedom to take a shower during the workday. Company saves, the organization saves $10,000 per employee for those that work remotely because they don't have office rent, utilities, coffee, furniture, whatnot, none of that. Save money for employees, save $12,000 per year per employee. So if you're making, to use round numbers, if you're making, you know, oh, I can't do the math in my head quick enough. But anyway, depending on how much you make, saving 12,000 could be a pretty big deal. And better health. Both emotional health and physical health. Nearly all working professionals surveyed agreed that working from home was good for their health. 93% said it had a positive impact on their mental health. 90% said it had a positive impact on their physical health. And the top benefit of those was decreased stress. And we all know about stress these days. And this is the one. And I'm going to stop you. Remote workers, location, location, location. So their stress is less because they don't have to commute, obviously. And let's see, 36% of remote workers and 44% of hybrid workers plan to move and use that opportunity to move. I love that. The most common reason people moved was to be closer to family and friends. Millennials make up a large proportion of the remote workers, and many are choosing to move closer to family as they start their own families. So, and that's a trend that the experts think is going to continue. So that's some of the data. Educate. Okay, here we go. Legal risks. This part is Nancy. Legal risk for disabilities.
Yeah, I think
Hit it.
I'm sorry.
I was going to say, hit it, Nancy.
Okay. So this is something that's definitely coming up a lot, is that uh, during the pandemic, of course, suddenly companies who had never really even considered having a remote work policy were forced to have remote work policies. And then employees have resisted going back to the way things were because they were able to get business done, right? As long as they're doing their jobs, then there may be an opportunity. In an ideal world where we're thinking things through, there may be an opportunity for them to continue that. And what we're seeing currently is a risk for you demanding that all employees come back to work regardless, right? Without assessing whether or not they have a request for a reasonable accommodation and some sort of health backing for that. So what we're talking about there is a diagnosed condition where traveling to and from the workplace might need to be accommodated, or it could be what kind of setup is there once they get to the office, because that's another thing I don't think a lot of employers had considered. They downsize, some of them that could maybe move to smaller offices, maybe move to different floors, change to cut their own costs. So dealing with the disability factor, I have been working on several cases over the past year that tell me employers do not fully understand disability accommodations in the world of remote work. And what we're talking about are things like family medical leave. If someone's taking an approved FMLA leave, and then you're requiring them to continue working from home, you're not actually adhering to the law. You're not honoring the disability. So that could get you in a lot of hot water. So we're seeing a lot more of the increases around disabilities there. But some on the flip side of that, some other aspects of disability law that employers are not always thinking about is if you're allowing remote work, you may also have to look at what kind of setup your employee has at home. And if there is a disability that needs to be accommodated, you need to know what kind of work setup they have as far as their home office. And then we'll get into some of the bigger risks that I think most people know to think about, which are things like cybersecurity, et cetera. But at this point, talking about disabilities, we want to be thinking both disability accommodation in the office, during the commute, even though as an employer, you're probably not responsible for the commute, the strain on an employee for the commute could fall within a disability accommodation. And I'll give you the perfect example there is someone that maybe was able to work from home during the pandemic was diagnosed with a serious illness during that time they were working remotely, and then you have a return to office policy that says everybody has to come in for X number of days per week. You have to look at, well, where does this employee fit in that? So you'll have to do the dialogue to just, first get the medical evidence, or if it's it could be a mental health provider also, but you need to analyze what the disability is. And it's not going to be you get to know what the condition is necessarily. You're going to get it from a good doctor who understands this law. You're going to get a doctor's note that says, Nancy is treating in my office, and here's the way that her condition, not her diagnosis with the actual line item there, but this is how what I'm treating her for affects her work. I've read her job description, so you're going to hear that. Do you have a job description? You better, right? This is a good time to be thinking about that kind of thing as well. And then they're going to look at, here's my job description and what is the impact of my condition on my job description, so that you can then assess the accommodation. And it doesn't mean that you get to go in and demand whatever accommodation that you want if you're the employee, but you do start to have that constructive dialogue toward a solution. And that's what we're really looking at, is not so much control. And I think you've heard us over the course of the year talk about that, is if you're an employer that's trying to control the employee instead of have a dialogue with them to find solutions, that's usually where you end up in a lawyer's office.
I have a situation that I had a contract for a while, and we were allowed to work remotely, which I did. But there was we had to be logged in all the time, and their whatever system they were using, which I can't remember the name of it, but it would show if you'd been idle.
Mhm.
So if you're idle, the employer could assume you're not working. You're idle. You're not touching keys or, you know, talking or meeting or anything. Is that an invasion of your privacy, or does that not count or matter?
A classic lawyer answer is it depends. Right. It's because you can see that, for example, if first of all, they need to let you know, right? And at least in a lot of states, it differs from state to state what the privacy protections are around that.
Mhm.
In New York, it's similar for any kind of surveillance, really, of an employee. You have to notify them. Now, employees will forget. So if you're an employee and your employer tells you that, make note of that. Don't forget it, because you might forget and do something that could get you terminated as far as that goes. But in other states, it's probably not protected in the same way. But I have seen a trend away from that kind of monitoring. And then the pandemic brought some of it back, and now we're going back and forth. So I think one of the things that I've seen in that realm, which is why it's been scrutinized and a lot of employers are looking differently at that, is First of all, you don't know how reliable the software is. Just like you're saying, it might register you as idle, but maybe you took a phone call that was related to your work and you turned away from the computer, so it didn't register that you were doing that. We see this in some of the courses that I've taught. They have the ability, right? If we were doing this, and by the way, we're not. So we're not looking at whether you're on camera or are you engaged, but other systems can do that, and they will try to gauge whether the audience is engaged in the conversation. Are they looking away? Are they even in the room? Are they hearing any of this? And it tries to monitor that. Those things do get very sticky when you get to a lawsuit because, again, you have to authenticate the software. You have to have an expert come in and explain how that data was collected, and then an expert who can analyze that data. So a lot of employers said, wait, this is a lot of extra, and the software is not necessarily going to do what we had hoped, which is protect us from a serious lawsuit that's going to be very costly. So you'll often hear from me, the better approach would be to have some way of engaging and measuring whether the work is getting done. And I think we're going to continue to move, especially in professional services and office work, things that we're talking about that can be done remotely and from home. We're going to probably continue to see this trend to engage, to measure work by the value that's being produced. Are you getting the work done more so than the clock time? So I hope did that
Okay.
answer your
Yeah,
question?
yep, yep. And I have some data to share with you about this. Spectra, we have our questions are, and they're not questions, they're statements, but they're on a Likert scale. So from 1 to 5. So if you were exactly, the data comes out and it basically looks like a bell curve. So right smack dab in the middle would be 3.5. We have had a number of organizations that have measured telework, in-person work, and the different types. I just picked one. This was the latest one that was done. So this is post-COVID. This is a 2025 assessment, and they measured only telework, mostly telework, similar telework and in person, and mostly or only in person. And the results were amazing. And I've got an anecdote that I'll share a little bit later, but this is the data. So for 2 questions in management, because we measure management, culture, and policies, practices, and procedures. So this statement, management sets a positive example for our organization in terms of inclusion. Only telework, mostly telework was 4.1, so they were above average. Similar amounts of telework and in-person, 3.9. Only telework, 3.8. In-person, or mostly in-person, 2.9. That's in a scale that only goes from 1 to 5. A gap from 4.1 to 2.9 is significant. Another management question was, management holds all employees equally accountable for their actions and behaviors. Is everybody treated same? Highest was only telework, 3.8, then mostly telework, 3.4, similar amounts of telework and in-person, 3.1, only in person, 2.9. So once again, the very different perceptions. And if you weren't measuring that and you just went by the average of, here's all our employees, you wouldn't get it. Interesting in this survey, the culture questions, the telework and the in-person, they were virtually the same, 4.1, 3.9, 3.8, they were all a little bit above average, but they were in alignment. And then our last category, I'll just give you one question, and this is policies, practices, and procedures. Disrespectful and non-inclusive behavior is not tolerated in this organization. Only telework, 4. Mostly telework, 3.7. Similar amounts, telework and in-person, 3.3, which is below average, and mostly or only in-person, 2.9. So, the big story here is that if you are not measuring, you don't know. You don't know what you don't know if you're not measuring. So
So
that's
Chris,
the
I'm just going to ask you to explain that a little bit more. I know you love data and I know you love numbers. So if I were to characterize what I think I heard
mhm.
is that there's greater consistency than in telework than there is in the organization that you were talking about. Is that what you're saying? Is that it was more consistent to have inclusive policies, management applying rules equally, et cetera?
What this data shows is that the telework people had a more positive perception of
Okay.
their management and their management and their policies, practices, and procedures. They had a more positive perception than the people that were forced to go into the office all the time.
Okay.
And on a bell curve, they were on the downside of if the bell curve goes left to right, they were on the downside of the left curve. They were over there, and the people that worked remotely were over here. They were positive, and in culture, they were all positive, telework and in person. So the perceptions of how they felt were very different depending on where they worked.
Yeah.
Does that help?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure it was really clear for everyone
Yeah,
because
that's
sometimes we get so deep in the numbers that we forget what we're really trying to achieve. And one of the things that comes to me from this conversation and recognizing the data is that the perceptions are very important, as we know, right? That because the perception of your workplace is going to determine whether or not employees file typically. Employees aren't going to file in places that they like, right? Where they feel like they're treated with respect and given the autonomy that they were hired to have. And I think in particular, it's interesting on this particular topic because we're probably dealing with professionals. It's rare that you have entry level employees working from home, although that's more common these days because you can work a phone center, for example, from your home. Either way, these are people that operate with a certain degree of expectation of autonomy. So when you're demanding they come back into the office where they can be, micromanaged, I think you're going to get that perception. So the reason I stop and make that point is because even though the perceptions are looking good, don't follow those blindly and go, yay, look at us, pat ourselves on the back. You still need to find out why they have those perceptions and kind of check the data. Make sure you're
yeah.
still talking to your employees, and you're going to hear me say that over and over and over again. Keep
Well,
talking to your
yeah, and
employees.
you need to, whether this was a DEI survey or an engagement survey, if they start breaking it down, which is the same way we break it down in the rest of the survey, we do, race and ethnicity and age and disability status. We have 7 different categories that we check. This one on telework versus in person was a custom category that they asked. They could have asked employee engagement sorts of questions, and that might have shown the same thing. This particular client was a university, and they were all salaried.
Yeah, that's what
So,
I figured. So that's great. And you would expect people at certain levels to have certain perceptions and desire the autonomy and not necessarily need as much oversight, right? That's where I talk to employers all the time about making sure you're hiring for that fit,
mhm,
job fit, right? I believe it's Jeanette Sibley talks about that. She's written a book that's how to hire amazing employees, and she talks about exactly that. Is most of the time the struggles, and I see it as an employment attorney, the struggles that we're seeing between employer and employee are often it's an incompatibility, right? And some of that can be overcome, and some of it was just poor hiring process, some of it's failure to train. Sometimes it is something as simple as failing to take the temperature of your workplace and then talk to your employees about how to make it better, right?
Yeah.
There is one other legal risk I don't know if we're going to get to yet, but I want to note that when we're talking about the disabilities, and this is a diversity chat, right, is we are seeing, because of these mandatory return to office policies, we are seeing an impact in particular with certain groups, right? We are seeing this in particular with women. We're seeing women leave the workforce.
And Black women in particular.
That was my next point, is it, and a
Yeah.
lot of women of color. It's a lot of women who have caregiving duties, really is where they're making the choice to opt out of the jobs that they're in that might force them to return to the office. And we are seeing unfortunately an upward trend in that, where more and more women are making that choice. And we do know still statistically that women have most of the caregiving duties in this country, both with children and other family members, whether it be parents or aunts or cousins, etc. So we're definitely seeing a disparate impact on a lot of the marginalized communities.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. So employer mandates.
Here we go.
There was an executive order that said everybody has to go to work. Everybody has to go to the office. Um, is that true? And if someone does get fired, can they get fired because they wanted to work from home? It depends.
Of course, it depends. Now, I will say, as far as the executive orders for coming out of the White House, that's specifically for government employees. And there is authority to do that if you're working in a government agency, right? So that the executive order can cover that. Similarly, if you're an employee who has been working from home and your employer mandates that you come back in, unless you do have a diagnosed condition that might interfere with your ability, right? That you have a diagnosed condition that causes a disability that needs to be accommodated, there's a chance that you will be required to go back to work in the office if your employer mandates it. So they do have the freedom to change the terms and conditions of your employment, unless, for example, which I think is rare, but we need to throw it in there as a possibility, unless you have an employment contract, not an offer, but an employment contract that says you may work from home X number of days up to the entire amount of your work. Unless you have something that gives you more than what the law provides, you're probably going to have to go back to work
Okay.
in the office.
And I have, both Nancy and I have lots of anecdotes to share about this going back to work, but I'm going to share one. I'll just read it. It's not too long, but it's from somebody wrote this on LinkedIn. So it's public knowledge and can be shared. Okay, this person, woman, for over 2 years during the pandemic, I worked remotely. When my late husband was undergoing chemotherapy and hospice, remote work allowed me to stay employed and be present for him. 2 weeks after his passing, I was back at work, still contributing because of flexible arrangements. For the past 2 years, I've continued a hybrid schedule. Now, facing a double foot ankle reconstruction that will take over a year to recover from, I've been told I only qualify for 30 days of remote work. I'm grateful to have sick leave and short-term disability benefits, which will allow me to step away completely for several months. But here's the reality. I'd rather keep working, stay engaged, and continue contributing. My team is already short-staffed. My managers want the work done. The only barrier is policy. This raises an important question. Who do rigid return to office policies really serve? They don't serve the mission. They don't serve the community. They don't serve employees or even managers who need to have the work completed. Remote and hybrid options are not just perks. They are proven tools that keep people employed through hardship, maintain productivity, and strengthen organizations. Policies that remove flexibility don't solve problems, they create them. It's time we stop politicizing remote work and start recognizing for what it is, a practical, humane solution that benefits everyone. Comments?
Mic drop. No, just kidding.
Mic drop.
Um,
I know.
I think, although I agree with so much in those statements, I think the reality is the questions are real, right? The who does it benefit, or at least appear to benefit, and I think now we're back into this discussion of perception. There's a lot more going on before a return to office policy is implemented. So I think that's where I would start is let's talk about what you're trying to achieve with return to office and then break it down. I think what we end up doing on so many issues these days, right, is we do politicize them. Although when you're dealing with people, everything it has some layer of politics to it, whether it's Democrat versus Republican kind of politics or it's inner office politics, it's still political. So let's just accept that that's the way it is. It's similar with, biases. We all have them. Just deal with it. You're a living human being, right? You're gonna have these
See your biases.
all right, all right. So
Yeah.
let's just say, okay, let's get to focusing on solutions. And in order to understand where to go with solutions, we need to first find out what is the intent of the return to office policy. Then we need to look at the other side of what is the intent of the employee, such as this one, who's saying, I want to continue working and being at home after my surgery would allow me to do that. Instead, they're forcing me to take time off. And in that situation, technically the employer has some, probably, I'm not giving legal advice. I forgot to give that disclaimer, right? This is always general information, but that employer doesn't necessarily have to create a special policy that says you can work with an accommodation. In most cases, again, this is something I would tell her she should probably talk to legal counsel if her human resources department or whoever serves in that function in her employer is not adequately addressing the issue. We obviously don't have the full story here, and that's okay, but we can still look at it from what I always do when I'm resolving these conflicts is we try to get to a simple statement of what do we disagree on here. And I think we could say we disagree on whether there's value to return to office in a situation like this. And then we go, okay, what's the interest of the employer? What's the interest of the employee? And what's best for everyone under the circumstances? Talking about what she's saying, that they're already understaffed. Losing another contributor, even who is working part time, might cause substantial hardship to her peers. And a lot of times, depending on the size of the organization, the people making the decisions aren't necessarily seeing it that way, right? So when you have management that's willing to be solutions oriented, you have a much different outcome. And that's another reason I come and do these with Chris is to call those of you that are in management positions into that conversation of at the end of the day, you're charged with producing certain results in the organization. And you do that through managing the conduct of your employees and the performance of your employees. So if you remember that, and then you can kind of deconstruct it from there, you can come up a lot of times with really creative solutions. And that's what we're asking you to do. In our minds, that's what DEI was all about. not necessarily quotas or exclusions, the things that for some reason people think are embedded in DEI, right? But when we really look at what was the intent of DEI, that's what it was about, is creating opportunities, finding creative solutions, and having things keep moving.
And with respect and inclusion
Right.
for, yeah. So activate, and keep in mind, and this is a little bit of review, that DEI activity that might be at risk is if it confers a preference, meaning that some individuals are treated more favorably than others. We just talked about that in terms of disability and accommodations. The preference is given to members of a legally protected group. This is Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. Race, color, religion, national origin, sex, and later disability was included at a later
And
date.
age.
And then if the preference relates to a palpable benefit, such as a job, a promotion, a pay raise, a work assignment, or access to training or development opportunities, it could be a DEI activity that is at risk. Is that good?
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
I want to jump in on this because you got all the words right, and I think that's awesome, right? But one of the other reasons, and really, I mean, that I don't mean that in a, I'm sorry if that sounded
No,
at all
that's
in
okay.
negative. What
That's
I'm
okay.
getting at is like the language of the statute's important, right? And we're seeing this happen at the Supreme Court level too, that you've got a lot of textualists on the Supreme Court. But the reason I stopped and said, yeah, all the words are there, but we have to look beyond the words. And that's what we're talking about with policy too, right? Just
Mm-hmm.
demanding that it's, follow the rules to the letter always without any exception. It just doesn't work. So the reason I stopped is that there are a lot of other things to consider. And I think one of the things we're going to have to look at, especially because we had the Muldrow case that was decided last year, and that made it easier for employees to say that an employment decision was adverse to them, even if it didn't have an economic value attached to it. So in her case, she lost a very prestigious position, but she didn't lose any salary. And so this is something that I felt like we needed to stop and zero in on a little bit, because some of your employees are going to see that Chris gets to continue working from home, but they're telling me I have to keep going in. And you've now got yourself in a situation where maybe Chris is being accommodated for some sort of medical or mental health condition, and you're not allowed to talk about that, right? Because her privacy is protected, and opening that up could cause another problem. So I just wanted to stop and say, we understand that that's the juggling act that you're doing as employers and managers and business owners. That's also why I encourage you to make those kinds of decisions under the guidance of legal counsel. And I'll tell you, one of the reasons you do that is because, one, you're probably not an expert. So I'm going to give you the second reason is because you're not necessarily the expert at the legal nuance of this. Sometimes you get a lawyer so that you got somebody else in that pool with you if you get sued. And I sometimes hate telling you that as a lawyer. I realize I might be shooting myself in the foot, but really you're pulling somebody else into that game to try and get it right. These are very nuanced and difficult cases to navigate.
It's like
So
when you get your taxes done, if your tax preparer person is the person, if you get audited, they go with you
yep.
and they can do a lot of the talking and you don't have to.
And that's
They
also why I tell you to get insurance, right? Because then you got that duty to defend clause in there too. But you have to make sure
okay.
your insurance covers employment claims, such as
So,
discrimination.
what are your options if you're an employee?
Well, if you're an employee and you want to work from home, so maybe you're like the woman who posted on LinkedIn and you want to continue working from home, and now your employer has a return to office policy. I get it. I know because I see it. The moment you hear that and you say, okay, well, I just need to go find a doctor to say I have a diagnosed condition. Don't do that, because if you're lying about it and you're found out it's fraud, please don't do that. But if you do have a legitimate reason for wanting to work from home or needing to work from home, then make your case. But understand that one of the problems that I see a lot with employees is they'll go to the employer demanding something. And what we want to do, because as the employee, you really aren't in the same power position, right? You don't have the same level of leverage. So the way you get that leverage is by persuading your employer. Show them where you've done an amazing job. Talk about the results that you've gotten from working from home. Talk about how difficult it would be for you to do the same level of work. Help them see. It's not that they are an automatic no, always, but depending on the size of your organization, sometimes they have these kind of black letter policies and check the box kinds of operations, because they're so large and they're trying to make sure that people are being treated the same. So when you have an exception, you have to sell them on why you should be the exception instead of the rule. If you go in and just demand, you're probably not going to be heard. So learn some persuasion, but you're going to have to give them data. Right. And well, I'm talking to you, Chris, and you're the data person. But
Mhm.
it's much more persuasive if you can connect the dots for somebody instead of just going in with a demand. And this is classic negotiation technique too. If you go in with just a demand, the only thing you leave them with is yes, no, or a counteroffer. But if you go in with more than that, there's a lot more room to negotiate.
And
So
have a discussion
right. And
rather than an,
that's a big part of it too. Always go in willing to have a discussion. Be as curious about what they're trying to achieve as you want them to be about what you're trying to achieve.
okay.
It's a
And
partnership.
yeah, and I'm looking at the time, so I'm going to kind of move us along here to the lead part. So if you're a consultant, um, measure, measure. If you're a consultant, explain why measurement is necessary and you can empower others. So I don't know how many of you have this book. It's Reconstructing DEI, a practitioner's workbook by Lily Zhang. And Lily says that one of the things that you can do is empower others. So there's kind of 3 steps to that. Make connections between your power within a context and the obstacles in that context, and how you can use your power, considering the context, to empower others. Then plan how you need to center the needs of those you want to empower before taking action. So considering their point of view, and then reflect on how you might mitigate some of the common failure modes of empowerment. And in this book, it's a workbook, so it's got checklists that you can do and self-reflection questions. And I highly recommend it to tackling this issue and other issues. But this one that we're talking about today is work from home. But it also, it applies to so many other DEI sorts of issues. I highly recommend it. If you're internal, and this is Nancy,
And I think I've already hit on this a lot. So
yeah,
I'm just going to do a quick review of that. Is really it is keeping that communication open. And like I said, you need to remember, if you're the employee, that you're in a position of persuasion. If you're in management, you probably already know that. I would say on both sides, you need to make sure you're reviewing things like the Americans with Disabilities Act What is a reasonable accommodation? How do you request it? What's the process? And not just the process. Something else that's been coming up a lot lately is not just what you've documented, but you need to know what your practice is. And that's where collecting the data from with organizations like Spectra come in. But discussing things in the context of the law when you're needing to request that accommodation under the ADA is one thing, but don't be shut down by the idea that you don't have a medical or mental health condition. A lot of employers will work with you, but you're going to have to sell them on the benefit to them. That's classic sales. Again, you always need to be thinking about how does it land for the people on the other side? What's in it for them? And if you can help them connect those dots, you'll be in good shape.
Okay.
Can't guarantee you'll get the accommodation and that you'll get to work from home, but you'll at least be able to make an educated decision about whether this is going to work for you.
Okay. And I don't see any questions, but I do want to comment on the 109 companies that support DEI. I have to check my bias because I do have a bias. Chick-fil-A is rated as DEI positive, and that was a surprise to me. So the next one, do you have your go bag ready? Immigration and workplace survival. And this is huge right now. For people that, whether or not you um, have some, are an immigrant, you could be a naturalized citizen, you could be a citizen with a green card. But anyway, they're taking people. What do you need to have ready to go? What can you do to help others who you are working with, your colleagues? So those are the next ones. If you have a suggestion, email Nancy or I, or put it in the chat. There's a lot of organizations right now that are doing legal issues for DEI. So I'm not sure, Nancy and I haven't talked about this. I don't know if we'll, continue it in 2026, because there's a lot of other players that are doing this sort of thing now. When we started it, nobody was doing it. So early adopters, yes. Um, so anyway, that's it. Unless you have questions, I'm going to stop sharing and look in the chat.
And while you do that, I'm going to throw in one other thing that we skipped over because we thought we were going to run out of time. Um, you asked, what can you do if you're a worker, really is how we were framing that.
Yeah.
And sometimes people will say, well, can I just be an independent contractor and come back and do the same job and then work from home
Oh,
that way? So I just wanted to throw up a red flag of caution there that it's much more detailed than that. And I would highly recommend that whichever side of that or that conversation you're on, that you do that under the guidance of legal counsel, because a lot of people don't realize when they go out as an independent contractor, they're basically declaring themselves an independent business. And that means a lot of taxes need to be collected, certain filings need to be done. If you're um, subcontracting any piece of the work, there, all of that needs to be addressed. And then you're going to have contracts and insurance. And a lot of times the company you used to work with will have a hold harmless clause in there that you better understand.
thank you. And it looks like everybody's checked out, so it's just you and me. And I
And
have
Adrian.
I have a,
Hi,
I
Adrian.
have, oh, is it? And I have a fruit fly around my head. So, um, I'm going to stop recording. Stop. Yes.